Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I would like to start saying that today in Australia, we celebrate the National Sorry Day, when we remember and acknowledge the past injustices caused on Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities due to the stolen generations. We take this opportunity to reflect on past social injustices and look for opportunities to understand the spirit of working together. Welcome again to our CSTFA webinar series. The Center for Sustainable Tropical Fisheries and Aquaculture focuses on researching the aquatic and aquaculture systems that produce food, but also the industries and communities that utilize them. By providing research outputs for sustainable food production to resource managers, we help secure aquatic food production in the tropics for future generations. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cayne Layton. Cayne is a research fellow at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in the University of Tasmania. His research interests revolve around the population, community, and restoration ecology of macroalgae and rocky reefs. He's passionate about scientific communication, and today he will talk about the feasibility and future of restoring Tasmania's disappearing giant kelp forests. Before I let Cayne start, I just wanted to remind the audience that you can type your questions on the Q&A, and we're gonna have some time at the end of the talk. Thanks for being here with us, Cayne, and over to you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Cecilia. And thanks for the great introduction and the acknowledgement to today is National Sorry Day. Now, I apologize, I'm sitting on a wheelie chair, so I'm going to spend all webinar sliding around. So it's just, we'll all have to put up with it. Yeah, thanks so much for the invite and thanks for having me. I'm actually an alumnus of JCU. I did my first year of my bachelor's at JCU Cairns, in fact, not Townsville. But yeah, it was an excellent year. And then I'm originally from New South Wales, the south coast of New South Wales in Canberra, and then I moved back there to finish my degree at the ANU. So I guess today I'm just going to talk about some of the work we're doing down here, the lab that I'm involved in, what we're up to, and also kind of some of the next steps and some of the complementary projects. This project is really quite large and it's really kind of taken on a life of its own, and so there's quite a lot of kind of tentacles that spread out all over the place. And that's why there's that breakdown in the title. You know, it's talking about the feasibility of restoration, but it's also talking about the future of restoring Tasmania's giant kelp forests. And our work is supported by the Climate Foundation and the NESP Marine Biodiversity Hub. But we have collaborators all throughout the University of Tasmania, where I'm based, all throughout Hobart, Tasmania, but also internationally. So like I said, there's lots of kind of tendrils of the project reaching off all over the place. Okay. So first up, kelp forests. So kelp forests are these incredibly productive biodiverse ecosystems, and they're spread around the world in temperate, subpolar, even some polar latitudes. And you know, they're incredibly productive. Some of the most productive environments in the world, you know, more productive than some of our most intensively managed agricultural lands. And kelp forests kelp are ecosystem engineers. They're habitat formers, they're foundation species. And you know, basically what that means, that really kind of narrows down the key function of kelp forests. And just like forests on land, that's exactly the same kind of function that kelp forests have under the water. They create all that structure, they create physical complexity, they change the environment. You know, that area beneath the kelp canopy is often a lot darker. Its flow is lessened in that environment. That affects sedimentation regimes, for example. So it really kind of modifies the environment, both directly and indirectly, and adds a lot of that physical complexity, but it also adds energy. It also is, you know, the base of the food chain in many ways. In addition to the kind of creation of habitat, there's a lot of ecosystem services that kelp forests provide us if you want to take more of a human-centric look. Like I said, it's the foundation for coastal food webs and coastal fisheries. It also provides a lot of coastal defense and protection. So in terms of ameliorating waves and swell and minimizing erosion. And because of their massive biomass and massive production, or potential rates of production, they're really also important in nutrient cycling and carbon storage as well. And that last thing, carbon storage, is something that's starting to get a bit more notice, and something, if I have time, I'll touch on a bit later. So Australia has some of the most spectacular kelp forests in the world, really, and we have this massive temperate reef system that not many people know about, but it's dominated by kelp. Obviously, everyone's heard of the Great Barrier Reef, But there's an equally amazing large temperate reef system in Australia, which we call the Great Southern Reef. Just like the Great Barrier Reef, it's thousands of interconnected reefs, in excess of 3,000 interconnected reefs in the case of the Great Southern Reef. And it stretches over 8,000 kilometres. So from the eastern coastline, the border of New South Wales, Queensland, all the way around our southern coastline in Tasmania, up to a similar latitude in Western Australia. And it's a real biodiversity and endemism hotspot. And that endemism in particular is really very, valuable and one of the real iconic aspects of the Great Southern Reef. Because depending on the taxa, you're looking at up to 30 to 80% of the species are endemic. And so found nowhere else in the world, to clarify what I mean by endemic. And then again, taking that more kind of anthropocentric, human-centric view, it directly generates in excess of 11 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars of economic value each year to the Australian economy. And that's just direct economic outputs in terms of, like fisheries and stuff like that. The indirect economic benefits and indirect social and kind of those non-economic values, especially in coastal communities around Southern Australia, are totally unknown and definitely undervalued. Like I said, one really kind of the most amazing aspect in some ways of the Great Southern Reef is that really high levels of endemism and biodiversity. And, it's home to a whole bunch of weird and wacky animals. And, pretty much everything you can see on the screen right here occurs nowhere else in the world. It's the Great Southern Reef and that's it. And, these aren't some kind of really rare creatures that you don't see. These are all pretty much common creatures that you can see on any kind of given dive on the Great Southern Reef. So incredibly colorful, incredibly photogenic environments. The Great Barrier Reef obviously gets a lot of attention, rightly so. I've done quite a bit of work on the Great Barrier Reef, but really I think the Great Southern Reef is massively undervalued and massively underappreciated. It's also kind of unknowingly close to a lot of Australia's population. About 70% of Australia's population lives within 50 kilometres of the Great Southern Reef. So, it really is in a lot of our backyards, but it has far less of a presence in our national consciousness than the Great Barrier Reef. You talk about reefs in Hobart and in Tasmania, and our local paper, the Hobart paper, will run stories on the Great Barrier Reef, and it's under threat. And sadly, the Great Southern Reef is under threat as well, but we hear about it a far lot less, even in southern Tasmania. One other aspect, I guess, of the endemism, which is really important for the Great Southern Reef, is the really deep levels of taxonomic endemism. So we're not talking about species particularly, or even genera that occur nowhere else. That the levels of endemism can go right up to kind of family level. So families of organisms that occur nowhere else on Earth. And for algae especially so, I've heard the Great Southern Reef kind of described as like the Amazon for algae. There's just a massive amount of diversity there, really, that doesn't occur anywhere else on Earth in kind of a similar scale. And again, really, really high levels of endemism. So really high value in terms of what lives on the Great Southern Reef. It doesn't really occur anywhere else. Just see what's next. It's all a surprise to me. So like I said, just like the Great Barrier Reef, the Great Southern Reef is also under stress from a range of anthropogenic stresses. And that's affecting the associated kelp forests, which the kelp really are the foundation of the Great Southern Reef. So ocean warming and marine heat waves are really a large problem in the Great Southern Reef. In addition to being kind of biodiversity and endemism hotspots, the Great Southern Reef is also, or Southern Australia is also ocean warming hotspots, so less positive kind of hotspots, literal hotspots. And southwest of Australia and southeast of Australia are two particular global warming hotspots in the marine environment. And in southeast Australia in particular, it's warming about 4 times the global average, so really incredibly quickly. And Australia is also quite unique in that it's got 2 poleward flowing boundary currents. So on the east coast, we've got the East Australian current, and on the west coast, we've got the Lewin current. And they're both kind of warm water, nutrient poor currents that flow from the tropics into the temperate regions. And that has a lot of implications in terms of ocean warming and marine heat waves. For example, in early 2011, there was a large marine heatwave in Western Australia, and that wiped out about the 100 northernmost kilometres of kelp forest in Western Australia. That was 100 kilometres of kelp forest got wiped out because of that marine heatwave, and they haven't come back. That's basically a permanent retraction of the Great Southern Reef. In addition to the kind of direct effects of ocean warming and climate change, there's also indirect effects, such as range expanding herbivores. And that includes sea urchins, which I'll chat a bit about in a tick, but also subtropical fish. So for example, there's subtropical fish that are spreading south from areas like the Great Barrier Reef and kind of southern Queensland, bloody Queenslanders, coming into New South Wales and eating a lot of the kelp. These herbivorous subtropical fish species are moving into areas that and interacting with kelp that they traditionally, this ecosystem wouldn't exist, where you have subtropical fish interacting with the kelp, and that herbivory is really affecting a lot of the northern kelp forests on the east coast of Australia. Urbanisation and pollution are also issues. Around Adelaide, they've lost a lot of their kelp forests because of urbanisation, increased runoff, increased nutrients. And you can see that middle photo there is where this Aclonia or common kelp forest has transitioned to just a turf algae dominated reef. And I was talking earlier about that physical complexity that kelp forests give us, and you can see there, it's just all that complexity has just been wiped out. It's basically just a scuzzy kind of sedimenty moonscape. Also, Sydney Harbour has also experienced quite a significant reduction in kelp forest due to urbanisation. And Sydney used to have the sewerage from Sydney used to directly outfall onto the beaches. And that increase in nutrients and increase in pollution actually caused a decline in a species of kelp called crayweed in Sydney Harbour. And they lost a lot of those forests. Now, throughout the late 90s, they fixed a lot of that wastewater infrastructure. They moved that infrastructure offshore, so they're deep water outlets now. But the kelp didn't come back. So there's been a really, really great project there called Operation Crayweed, looking to restore some of those kelp forests and have restored those kelp forests. And that's a really important factor, is that the driver of kelp forest loss has to be addressed. And I'll talk about that in a tick a bit more. Another anthropogenic stressor that's happening on the Great Southern Reef is changing oceanography. Like I mentioned, those two boundary currents. The East Australian current in particular seems to be strengthening. And so it's bringing that warm, nutrient-poor current further south than it did traditionally. And that's causing, in places like Tasmania, that's causing an increase in coastal water temperatures and a reduction in coastal nutrients. And it also brings animals with it, larvae, such as sea urchins. And we've seen this southern march of the long-spined sea urchin, Centrostephanus rogersi, into Tasmania over the past several decades. They've actually been able to track it based on anecdotal reports and kind of dive surveys spreading into Victoria, the Bass Strait Islands, northern Tassie, halfway up Tassie, and then it's pretty much down now to the southern tip of Tasmania. So this is just a Windy's weather kind of forecast site, and this is just an image I pulled off yesterday. So this is the East Australian current, and when it actually travels south, it's not like a big conveyor belt, unlike you see in kind of the movie Finding Nemo. It throws off these eddies, so these large kind of whirlpools that are tens, 100 kilometers across, and often kind of submerged quite deep as well. And these eddies spiral, and they bring these warm, nutrient-poor masses of water, of EAC water, into Tasmania. So these kind of anthropogenic stresses are causing declines in kelp across Australia and really across the world. Kelp forests are suffering across the world. Unfortunately, some of the most kind of, some of the worst declines have happened in Tasmania, and they've really affected a species that we have here called giant kelps. Giant kelp also occurs to a lesser extent in Victoria and South Australia, but Tasmania is really the heartland for this species, or it was kind of really the heartland for this species. It's jammed up there. Sorry, not changing. Oh, there we go. All right, so the losses of giant kelp in Tasmania are really associated with the increasing influence of the East Australian current. And that's, again, that increasing coastal water temperatures and the reductions in coastal nutrients. The urchins certainly haven't helped, but really the giant kelp was on the way out by the time the urchins really became an expansive problem. So the urchins have really been impacting the common kelp, which also naturally occurred in Tasmania and which replaced the giant kelp. So when the giant kelp is lost, it's replaced by the common kelp. And the common kelp's far more temperature tolerant. And it kind of spans that whole breadth of the Great Southern Reef, common kelp. So it's far more temperature tolerant, it grows up to almost the Queensland-New South Wales border. And so over the past several decades, we've lost about 95% of our giant kelp in Tasmania. And that's led to it being listed. In fact, it was the first federally listed threatened marine community. So that's under the EPBC Act, so the Environment Protection, Biodiversity Conservation, that federal piece of legislation that we had. It was the first listed marine community as endangered or threatened in Australia. And that was in 2012. Unfortunately, not much has been done since then. So is there help for our kelp? Can we use restoration as one of the tools in our toolbox for kelp conservation? Like I said earlier, a critical first step is really removal of the stressor, or at least alleviation of the stressor. So like I said, giant kelp is really, the loss of giant kelp is linked to changing oceanography. That's not something we can fix in the short term. It's linked to climate change. And while we can certainly should get a handle on carbon emissions, that's not going to have an effect on over the short term. So, if we can't change the environment or take the environment back to the state that it was, how do we look at alleviating those stresses? So can we potentially help the kelp become more, can we harness the existing kelp and kind of utilize some of that physiology that's existing in the population to help restore populations that are more future-proofed or more adapted to the new and novel environment and conditions that are already happening and are projected to increase in the future. And this has received a lot of attention on the Great Barrier Reef in terms of supercoral and warm water tolerant corals. And so we've just blatantly ripped that off and we now call them super kelp. So the urchin problem can be fixed. I mean, it's still a really wicked problem and there's a lot of complexity to it, but basically we know how to solve that problem. We remove urchins. It's not quite as simple as that, the act of going out and removing them. There's now about 20 million of these urchins in Tasmania, but that driver of kelp forest loss can be addressed largely. The real core issue for giant kelp is that changing oceanography, that changing temperature. So like I said, we've lost about 95% of giant kelp in Tasmania over the past several decades. So what's happened to that other 5%, those remnant forests? You'd assume with this warm water current coming into Tasmania, from the north, what you'd see, and this kind of thermally sensitive, this cold water loving, nutrient loving kelp, you'd expect to see a retraction, a poleward retraction that we'd see in many animals, temperature sensitive animals and organisms around the world, this poleward retraction into this pocket that is still conducive to their life. But that's actually not what we've seen. What we've seen instead is this kind of reduction across the entire range of giant kelp. So there's still stragglers all the way up in northern Tasmania, where the summer temperatures can be 3 or 4 degrees warmer than in southern Tasmania. The really big forests still primarily exist in southern Tasmania, and that's still, they're holding on there, but they've still suffered in southern Tassie as well. And what's the patches and the individuals that live in, that kind of remain across the rest of the range, they seem physiologically healthy. They're not bleached, they still grow quite large, they're still reproductive. So that kind of gave us this hint that, look, maybe something is happening here. Maybe we have to, set out to test some of these stragglers and see if they are more tolerant to warm water conditions just through evolution and natural selection that has happened in this crazy experiment that is climate change. So that's what we set out to do. So we sampled from, to begin with, we sampled from 6 populations across the range in Tassie, 3 in northern Tasmania and 3 in southern Tasmania. And like I said, that's 270 kilometres, and it's about a 3 or 4 degree temperature gradient. So really, really massive. We went to these populations, we could non-destructively sample them. Giant kelp had this specialised leaf at the base of the individual. You can see in that photo on the right. My mouse works, this one. So this is called a sporophyll. And these specialized blades or leaves are where the spores are produced. So we can go and we would just take a couple of them from an individual and sample a variety of individuals from a single site. And we could take them back to the lab and we can release those spores. And so now we actually have these permanent cultures of giant kelp here at the university, just upstairs. And so we have this breeding program. This is really the foundation for our breeding program. So like I said, collected from 6 sites, we now have 50 plus family lines growing, with each flask representing an individual or an individual family line. And the reason we call them family lines is obviously it's in that flask are the juveniles, the selfed juveniles from the individual that we collected them from. And the fact that they're kept under red light there is that retards their development. So it kind of puts them in this suspended animation where they don't mature to the next life stage. So kelp have 2 life stages. And this is the haploid life stage. So by keeping them under red light, it basically retards their development, stops them from maturing and growing, but they still grow vegetatively. So that means they increase what's called, so this life stage is called the gametophyte. They increase the quantity of gametophytes, but they never actually grow. So that means we can subsample from these flasks, these collections, test them without actually having to go back out and collect from the field again. So that's really, really valuable. And so we took these 50 plus family lines and we built this crazy system that allows us to test them all. I've shown a few people and they think it kind of resembles something from the Matrix with the seaweed, those pods that the people are in. So we grew them in what's called a common garden experiment. So this is where the individuals are grown under different conditions. So the condition we manipulated in this instance was temperature. So we grew them at 12, 16, 20, and 24 degrees. And that last temperature treatment, 24 degrees, was really intended to be the temperature that they die at. So we could test them from 12, 16, and 20, assess their survivorship and their growth, and then 24 degree would be the point that killed them all. So we know that they have an end point, they have an upper limit. And 24 is pretty much the published thermal maxima for these species. So the thermal maximum that these guys live at anywhere around the world. We also didn't add any nutrients. So like I said, Tassie at the moment is, the changing oceanography has caused quite a significant reduction in coastal temperature, in coastal nutrient levels, sorry. And they never were particularly high. Australia, our waters are quite nutrient poor, but in summer at the moment, they're basically totally nutrient deplete in terms of nitrogen and all the stuff that kelp needs to grow. And so we know that by adding nutrients, you can actually make them more thermally tolerant. It's almost like if they're stressed if they're nutrient stressed, it makes them more thermally sensitive as well. Rather, if they're got all the nutrients in the world and they're happy, it makes them more temperature tolerant. So by having ambient nutrient levels, which are very low nutrient levels, we were replicating what happens in the environment, and it allows us to really tightly test what's happening with their temperature sensitivity. So this is actually super, super preliminary, super hot off the press. What's today, Tuesday? I only finished counting these Friday morning. So I haven't even actually had a chance to go over some of these results with our larger lab group. But really, really promising, really quite exciting results. And this is the second time we've run this experiment. We ran it initially and picked up very similar results, but they were so stark and so clear and so kind of astounding to us that we immediately packed down the experiment, set it up again and ran it again just to confirm everything. And that second running has just finished. So really, really high levels of intraspecific variation. So these photos are all taken from the 20 degree temperature. And you can see in that far left one, 2 little individuals, really hard to see. In the middle, there's a few more on the far right. They're really, really large individuals. So they're all family lines taken from the same site, grown in the exact same conditions, same temperature, same nutrient levels. It's just the intraspecific variation there is causing really large changes in growth. Really large differences in growth, sorry. Amazingly, we even found some survivors at 24 degrees. Now, they could hardly be called, they weren't exactly thriving at those temperatures, but they were surviving. So that's really incredible. Like I said, that's the thermal maxima for these species. This is the temperature treatment we put them in to kill them all, to make sure that we had a crash point for these. So to find about half a dozen of our 50 plus families growing at 24 degrees was really, really outstanding. Another kind of weird thing that we found was that there's no consistent site or region effects. And by region, I mean north versus south. So regardless of where you collected the individual from, it's not really indicative at all of how it's going to perform thermally. The ones from the north are no likely to do better in warm temperatures than the ones from the south, and vice versa. The ones from the south aren't going to do any better in cooler temperatures. So that's really quite astounding for us. It shows that, that really high level of intraspecific variation is really driving a lot of their performance and their ability to survive in these really challenging conditions. And that's really the foundation for our work moving forward. We now know that this inbuilt physiology, this natural selection that's been happening we can harness this intraspecific variation and then we can breed these individuals and hopefully put them out in the lab, put them out in the field, sorry. So that's the next step. So the aim really is to breed these selected individuals that we tested from the lab and breed them up in really, really large quantities, which we can do with those gametophyte cultures, again, because they're lasting, that red light keeps them in suspended animation, so we can go back and tap them again and take what we need from them. So we'll grow those individual lines that we found were far more tolerant of warm water than the kind of population average, and we can put them into the field. So with the aim to create these self-sustaining and self-expanding seed patches of giant kelp. So the outplanting will happen at 3 trial sites in Southeast Tassie, and the patches are about 12 by 12 meters, so just below 150 square meters. And we've already done one of these. I mentioned that we've done the thermal testing twice. We've also, from the results from that first one, we outplanted them. We tried 2 different methods. One of them was unsuccessful. So in the second picture here, you can kind of see this is a bungee cord or an elastic cord stretching off into the distance that's been bolted and secured to the bottom. And we wrapped a twine around that. And the twine was seeded in the lab with microscopic kelp. And that's the way basically kelp aquaculture happens all around the world. So we thought that would be a really good method to test, to see if we could just move this twine onto the bottom. That's where the kelp grows from. Unfortunately, they didn't survive using that method. I think it's just a bit too finicky and there's just a lot of handling. And just methodologically it didn't work. But we put out also these microscope slides and these plates that were bolted to the rock at the bottom. And again, the plates in the lab, or the microscope slides in the lab have been seeded with microscopic kelp, and that method worked really well. So we got really high survivorship, and you can see just on those slides, that's actually thousands and thousands of baby giant kelp. And that photo at the end is not one of our patches, just to be clear, we're not at that stage yet. We haven't been able to get back out to test and to kind of re-examine the babies because of the COVID-19 situation. And the idea is that currently we're kind of waiting to get out. That's what we're all pretty much doing at the moment. We're waiting to get out. To plant the next round out to see how they go. But, it requires a little bit of patience at the moment. So the future. So once we know whether or not we can establish these patches, these self-populating, but also hopefully self-expanding patches of giant kelp, that's really that first piece of the question. That's that feasibility kind of aspect of the title that I was talking about. So, what happens after that? What happens in the future? So if we can get them to grow in the environment, which we are very confident we can, this selecting and breeding program is going to be ongoing. It's not something that's just going to happen now and we'll just restore kelp for as long as we can using this one population. The testing facility we've set up here is permanent, which is very nice. So we can just run these testing experiments multiple times a year. We can collect from different populations in Tasmania. We can, permanently be breeding and replanting individuals that we've identified as being more tolerant. And so that kind of helps maintain a certain level of genetic diversity in the population and make sure that we're not just pumping out the same family line and potentially promoting a monoculture. We're also interested in testing other populations. By other populations, I guess I mean some of that stuff from mainland Australia, potentially. Now, just to be clear, we're not looking to use these for restoration at the moment, but just to test the thermal performance of these individuals against the kind of Tasmanian giant kelp. And giant kelp also grows in California, in Chile, in South Africa. So we're really interested in getting some of that kelp and bringing it here and being able to test it as well. Because there's so much Antarctic science that happens in this building and at IMAS and the University of Tasmania, we have really stringent quarantine protocols and procedures here. So that allows us to potentially look at the possibility of bringing in these kelp from elsewhere because we have those stringent kind of policies in place already. But again, that stuff is not for outplanting. It won't go into the environment. It's just for testing in our facility here. We're also looking at population genetics. So again, using some of those populations from Victoria, and we've taken populations from northern Tasmania and southern Tasmania, those same sites that we tested at, to really examine some of the genetic foundations for the thermal performance that we've seen. And which is kind of cool. And seaweed genetics in some ways is decades behind other areas of genetics for just a weird quirk that all the polysaccharides and sugars and the mucus that makes up seaweed is actually quite chemically similar to DNA. So you get massive levels of contamination in your samples. So finding the methods to get a really pure, refined sample has been quite a challenge. So yeah, in many ways, seaweed genetics is quite far behind other areas. And for example, there's really been basically only one other study looking at seaweed genetics on this scale for giant kelp in Australia before. And that has showed relatively or really quite shallow or no differences between populations, which also kind of gave us confidence in the fact that, we're potentially moving northern kelp from northern Tasmania into southern waters. The genetic flow between all those populations is quite high, and the connectedness is very high. So yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's quite cool. We've collaborated with two labs, a lab in Chile and a lab in New Zealand, and we've sent them our samples. And one of them is going to do the SNPs for us, and one of them is going to do microsats for us. So these two different ways of analyzing genetics at the population level we're going to get that data back hopefully soon, and really kind of get a comparison of the two methodologies, but also a greater understanding of what's happening at the population level. We're also looking at doing genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, all the omicses, to again, try and understand some of the physiology, some of the finer scale stuff that's happening that's affecting the thermal performance of these individuals. And, again, this project's really about building the foundation, building that ecological understanding for us to then move forward. And obviously understanding all of that physiology and ecophysiology is incredibly important. So another thing we've recently done is using those cultures that are now permanent, and the ones under the red light here in Tasmania, we've established a seed bank, so a secondary spot. And so as a form of kind of insurance for our work, but also as a form of genetic conservation. Like I said, we've lost 95% of this species, absolutely massive levels of loss over the past several decades. So this, that places quite a high value on the individuals that we've collected already, especially if we're going to have an understanding of their genetics and some of that deeper physiology. So we've put them all aside into a secondary containment facility, and by keeping them at really, really low temperatures, I'm talking like 2 to 4 degrees and really, really low light, they effectively, can live forever. And we only really need to top up the water or do a slight water change every, 6 months, every 5 months, something like that, and they can just last there. So that's really interesting. Or actually, just prior to the COVID-19 shutdown or slowdown globally, we were looking at potentially getting some of them moved into international institutes as well, and maybe even the seed bank in Sweden. That's something we're really interested in doing. We're also really interested in acclimation. So again, that takes us back to that experimental side about looking at how the early life history, the environment and the conditions that the early life histories grow up in, can that affect their thermal performance later in life? And so that's going to tie into a lot of this breeding and crossbreeding potentially of different strains from Tasmania, and then that selecting experiment, really understanding how we can boost the thermal performance of these individuals as much as possible to buy them a bit of time while we get a handle on carbon emissions and kind of slow down some of that ocean warming. Like I said initially, there's a whole range of other projects that our lab's kind of working on. And this project is super large and really multifaceted now. It's relatively early days. It's really been going for about 18 months, but we've got a massive amount of kind of interest from a whole range of businesses and industries and the community, and it's been really, really brilliant. One of them has been a partnership with a local Indigenous Tasmanian community and they run the Weetapuna Aboriginal Corporation. And that relationship's very much about knowledge sharing. Obviously, they have thousands of years of social knowledge of individual bays and that understanding of the baseline of what giant kelp used to be. We've heard stories from a couple of community members who obviously grew up in Tasmania, and they can tell us about bays 30, 40 years ago that were so thick you couldn't drive a boat through them. And we've heard similar stories from community members around the state. So that's that kind of level of loss that we've seen. And these environments are obviously very valuable to Indigenous Tasmanians for a variety of reasons in terms of foodstuffs and foraging and the types of organisms that live in them. And what kind of got us first having this discussion and kind of developing and nurturing this relationship was this idea behind restoring sea country. They got in touch and said, look, this bay, we've seen the decline of kelp over the decades, and we're really interested in trying to bring it back. So what we're doing is we're actually going to train a variety of community members up in the skills you need to grow kelp, because it's actually relatively easy. I've heard of people doing it in their bathtub in the United States, would you believe? And so giving them the skills to grow giant kelp, potentially in a little facility or a little shed based on the land near some of these sites, and they can plant out some of their own patches, because that's ultimately what's going to be needed if we're going to upscale this restoration. Clearly 3 little patches of 150 square meters aren't going to restore giant kelp to the scale that we've lost it. So that upscaling question is really interesting, and it's really kind of something we've got to address. So by empowering the community to potentially be able to restore their own patches, that's pretty exciting, and that gives us one extra avenue of upscaling. Citizen science is another thing we're really interested in. So just at the end of last year, we launched an app to harness the observations of waterway users, especially recreational fishers, for their observations of giant kelp. Like I said, we've lost so much of it that it can be very hard to find where it actually still is. So just the logistics, just the practicalities of our team going out to sample it, we need a lot of local knowledge. It'll come and go, or it'll pop up in a place that it hasn't been seen for years. So we've formalized that, and we've actually got a lot of community members on board, and they can now log sightings. They can take photos of giant kelp where they've seen it. And this is an example of photos taken by community members around Tassie. And I think all of these are records of giant kelp in places that we thought giant kelp had been lost. So again, these patches are small. Normally say something like, they're no bigger than the size of this room. But on a webinar, that doesn't exactly help. But they're no bigger than, some of these patches are really small, no bigger than a lounge room at home, no bigger than a lecture theatre. So harnessing that massive wealth of knowledge, that local knowledge that citizen scientists have, has been really important to us and really exciting, and allows us to kind of get a better handle on the mapping of the giant kelp that's left, some of those remnant patches. Again, talking about upscaling, so we're really interested in kind of the economics of it, the cost-benefit analysis, and an upscaling of methods. Clearly having me and a couple of lab mates here from uni planting individual ropes or tiles of kelp is good at the small scale, but it's not going to work for restoration at scale. So we're really kind of cognizant of that fact, and we're really interested in the ability to upscale and expand those methods so we can potentially, restore kelp somewhat at the scale that it was lost at. So, that 270-kilometre coastline of eastern Tasmania. The urchins, like I said, they weren't necessarily a driver of kelp forest loss, but now that they're here, they're certainly causing issues. They're likely impeding recovery and a natural kind of recovery in places. And so there's other researchers here, not actually in our lab, but other researchers here that are looking at the urchin fishery. And we actually have a really, this year we've had a really good, healthy urchin fishery, again, before this global pandemic. They harvested more in last year and I think early this year than they had in the whole previous 5 or 6 years. So, hundreds and hundreds of tonne. I think it was 400 tonne last year. And that's actually having a really, really big effect. We're starting to see urchin numbers drop in some areas. But for the urchins, to cull the urchins enough that you get natural recovery, you basically need to cull 95% of urchins from a given area at the scale of like a square metre. So that's a really, really massive amount of work. So also looking at ways of, again, upscaling this and looking at new technology. They've got these, we've got colleagues at other universities who are helping develop these, what they call Terminator robots. And actually they don't look like that. They look more like that, which is, much more cutesy and maybe doesn't belie the name Terminator. But this idea is that it's autonomous. They can access deeper waters and they can work longer than a human diver, because that's, again, we know that we can get in. Culling is really effective. The harvesting of them for the fishery is really effective, but it's also very resource intensive. So a way that we can upscale that and potentially move some of those resources elsewhere. Bioplastics are another thing. Now, this isn't directly related to restoration, obviously, but looking at kelp-derived plastics is something that's really interesting, and it's linked to kelp aquaculture. Now, which I'll talk a little bit more about. I'm pretty close to time, so I'll be quick. So another thing that we're really interested in looking at is kelp aquaculture, developing this new industry for Australia or Tasmania. And some of the work we're doing is on mobile platforms. So the interest primarily at the moment, there's a lot of interest in moving kelp aquaculture offshore, and that frees up some of those issues around marine real estate, the marine estate, which in a place like Tassie, physically quite small. That marine estate is very, highly used and highly contested. So, you potentially remove some of those social license issues by moving further offshore. That comes with a whole range of technical problems, obviously. So the first photo is not of us, just to clarify. Our kelp probably is that size at the moment, but we haven't been able to go out again and check it, unfortunately. And while the kelp that I said we planted last year at the restoration site wasn't successful, using the same method but in an aquaculture setup, so instead of it having attached to the rocky bottom, it's attached to a line that's kind of strung in mid-water, has been massively successful and growing really, really quickly. And we're actually using infrastructure on an offshore fish farm at the moment in about 70 metres of, 50 to 70 metres of water. The kelp are only at 10 metres, but then there's a whole bunch of dark green and blue beneath you. So it's quite a challenging environment to dive in. And you can see some of that in that far right-hand photo. The underwater infrastructure is really very phenomenal. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole range of great byproducts. A few things of kelp aquaculture. One we're particularly interested in, which is a little bit peculiar, is some of the environmental spin-offs. Can we potentially make kelp aquaculture restorative or regenerative to the environment? Both funding kind of economic support for kelp restoration, so contributing to that restoration economy, but also physiologically, ecologically, with these mobile kelp platforms potentially, if we move them inshore for a certain period, potentially to escape storms over winter when the offshore environment's really rough, potentially that's also the season for kelp reproduction. So potentially we can use this dense floating mass of adult healthy kelp to just bomb a natural reef with spores, and maybe that'll help with some of the, maybe that'll help recruitment in that natural environment. So that's something we're looking at as well. And there's a lot of interest in kelp aquaculture and seaweed aquaculture in general in Tassie at the moment. Yeah, so this is just, no videos and PowerPoint are a fatal combination often. And I accuse the volume, I apologize for the volume. So the diving in these places can be relatively challenging. You can see there it's very swelly, it's very dark. And we're just hanging off this line that we plant our kelp on. So very briefly, I'll just talk about this is the last slide. So the common kelp, kind of the forgotten kelp in Australia. Giant kelp is very, as far as seaweed goes, it's probably the most charismatic of them all. It does attract a lot of attention. But like I said, when we lose giant kelp, it gets replaced by the common kelp. And common kelp is incredibly widespread. That map of the Great Southern Reef is basically a map of the distribution of Aclonia. It really is the foundation of the Great Southern Reef. And it forms these incredibly rich, productive environments. It only grows to about 6 foot tall, compared to something like giant kelp that can grow 30, 40 meters tall. So, they are different environments, but, undoubtedly, this species is also under threat and is incredibly valuable as well. So, this is actually the species I did my PhD on. It wasn't giant kelp. So this one's kind of got a soft spot in my heart, and something that we're also continually studying on in different aspects of their ecology. And I think that's it. Like I said, it's absolutely a massive program with collaborators all over the place, funders and supporters and partners really everywhere. And I just want to kind of leave you with that saying, from little things, big things grow. And that really is, a nice analogy for giant kelp themselves, from these microscopic spores up to 40 meters tall, for the restoration at scale from these patches, potentially for kelp aquaculture, that at the moment is, very small or basically non-existent in Australia, but has the potential to be massive. Also in terms of a lot of our Indigenous relationships and the ability to, give back something to the community and help, and help them as well. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cayne. That was really interesting. We have a question here. Do gametophytes and sporophytes from the same family line have the same temperature tolerance?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so obviously that's something we need to understand. Well, that's something we needed to understand before we set out on this project, because we are using the offspring from an individual. So work in our lab has shown that the inheritance of those thermal performance traits are passed on from adults to offspring. So we know that the testing of those juveniles, by breeding them and crossbreeding them, you can pass that thermal performance on as well. So yeah, good question.
We have a question from Mike Kingsford. I'm gonna let you talk, Mike.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, Cayne, look, interesting talk. Look, the immediate thing that came to mind to me is that hot water kills kelp, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why would you stick a whole lot of genetically manipulated kelp back in hot water? And also just to fight limpets, urchins, everything else out there. Why don't you just pump cold water on the reef?
Well, again, you're talking about questions of scale. So pumping cold water on the reef, I mean, it's not really going to work at the scale that we need it to. It's several hundred kilometers of coastline. Again, we're not necessarily putting the kelp outside of their natural thermal boundaries. It's just this thermal performance has been held in a relatively small proportion of the population, and we're just helping that proportion spread, so at the population scale it can become more tolerant of warm water conditions. Clearly, on the whole, this is really just a buying time exercise. What really needs to be done is a greater reduction of emissions and a reduction of the effects.
I guess they've tried some of those logistics in California too, but some of the challenges you're facing of, limpets, urchins, storms, just trying to make this stuff prevail with warm water pulses and so forth. It's quite a challenge. So I wish you luck. Yeah,
it definitely is a challenge. Yeah, I mean, the limpets, they're not a problem in Tasmania, or they're not really a problem in Australia in terms of their herbivory interactions. Giant kelp grows around the world, but interestingly, it's really ecologically different in a lot of the environments, the way it's controlled. They have tried similar things in California, but then they haven't tried the same type of breeding programs yet. So actually we're working with quite a few folk over there, and they're keeping a close eye on what we're up to.
Good on you. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a question from Damien Barrows here. Have there been any issues with outplanting the lab-bred kelp? I'm thinking social license or public or regulatory concerns.
Nope, zero. It's part of, the benefit in Tasmania is it's quite small. We have that relationship with the regulators. Before any of our work is permitted or before it's even planned and undertaken in the lab, we pick up the phone, we have these discussions with our regulators. We find out what they're worried about or concerned about. And that was something that came up. And again, we have that kind of, at least a basic understanding of the population genetics that, the connectivity between the populations is very high. So something from the north is similar to something from the south. And that again, we're not manipulating them in the way that, inserting novel genes or any of this. We're just harnessing existing genetic variation that exists in natural populations and just, helping that move. Clearly there's a human mediated aspect in there, but the regulators were happy with our understanding of that and have been supportive, very supportive, and so of the public. Giant kelp has such an iconic role in kind of the mindset of the marine environment for Tasmanians. And again, with that understanding that we have of kind of the population genetics at the moment, they've been welcoming and supportive, at least at the small scale, before we start upscaling. I think those discussions will be had again, rightly so. There's a lot of considerations to be had, but at the moment, no roadblocks.
We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Could giant and common kelp in Tassie run in commercial scale to support conservation and salmon industry in nutrient sequestration?
So nutrient sequestration is an interesting one. You basically need a massive amount of kelp to absorb the nutrients that some aquaculture has in some environments. But in the areas we're working, the flows are so phenomenal, which is part of the reason that these companies have moved offshore, that nutrient spiking and the nutrient loading in the environment is almost non-detectable. So again, you just need massive amounts of, where the issue is potentially in some of these inshore sheltered waters, and you need massive amounts of kelp to soak up the nutrients there. And again, then you have run into issues of social license and marine real estate. So it's something that's being looked at. At the moment, it's not quite as an easy solve as that, but kelp aquaculture has a whole range of massive benefits that I think there will certainly be an industry here in the not too distant future, but I don't think it'll be focused on bioremediation or the absorption of nutrients from aquaculture primarily.
Georgina Wood says, Great Cayne, if you have found high thermal tolerance occurring naturally across the Tasmanian range, not just in one area, wouldn't this suggest that natural recovery is inhibited by recruitment limitation by something else?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, at the moment, we've basically seen that physiologically, there is the potential for the spread of the population. So why isn't it happening? Something is happening ecologically. Recruitment limitation, like you said, is very likely. And we think it's potentially competition with common kelp. So when the giant kelp has died at a population level, the population of common kelp has moved in, and potentially that is then stopping the recruitment of giant kelp back into that environment, even when the adults thrive again and start producing spores. So that's another aspect we're looking at. In the specific patches that we're working in, we clear them. So the areas that we work in are just basically small patches of bare rock, effectively. We clear them of urchins, and then we monitor everything that comes back into them, including the kelp that we plant and self-recruitment. But again, yes, I mean, we're going to have to understand some of those ecological interactions better in the future to get a better understanding of that scaling of restoration.
And there's another question related to that. Why is there a patchy pattern of remnant populations down the east coast of Tasmania? Does this represent microclimates, cool spots, or tough resilient remaining kelp lines?
Yeah, short answer, we don't know. It's something we've really mulled over ourselves. None of the environments seem, there's no obvious differences, basically. So, it's in terms of that microclimate, some are almost sandy bottom, which is really peculiar. Some are cobbly, some are slabby, some grow on break walls. So in quite a, like a, human intensive environment and grey infrastructure. So there's no obvious answers, basically. It's something we're looking at, trying to understand the drivers and the abiotic conditions at the different sites. But we're just not sure why those individual populations that exist where they are, why they're there. And it can be really dramatic and really stark sometimes. You'll see a patch of giant kelp on a particular headland and it stretches really dense and healthy for about 25 meters and then bang, clear as that, just stops. There's still plenty of substrate there. There's, you know, a whole another rocky headland 100 meters away. Why isn't it there? We don't know. That's something that we're really interested in kind of figuring out to get a better understanding, obviously. If we can get a better understanding of why they live where they currently do, that's clearly going to help in the restoration efforts also.
Excellent. If anyone else has any other question. No more question from the audience. Ah, yes. I think there's one question coming from Anita Giraldo. Are you monitoring environmental factors in the field?
Yeah, so at the restoration sites, we're monitoring a whole range of factors there in terms of nutrient, coastal nutrients, temperature, the rest of it. And then we're also doing the same at the aquaculture sites. Again, to just get a better understanding of what causes the kelp to thrive, why it's growing where it does grow. Yeah, so yes.
We have another question here from Alice Howie. Has there been much investigation into the provisioning of ecosystem services from the kelp and benefits they may provide in the future?
Yes and no. I mean, we know that the ecosystem services kelp forests provide are really important, and there's been, you know, examinations elsewhere in the world, but in terms of Tasmanian giant kelp, no, there haven't really been, or even Australian common kelp, Australian kelp forests. There hasn't really been a detailed examination of their ecosystem services. You know, Australian temperate reefs are massively understudied and massively undervalued, like I said initially. So no, it hasn't been done. There's a few people at the moment, as far as I know, looking at it, which I think is going to be really important. Again, getting a better understanding, building up that foundation of knowledge of how these ecosystems should be valued is only going to help us in the future in restoration and conservation.
Another question from Trini Pratiwi. It's really challenging to cultivate temperate seaweed species in knowing that we have only a small window to outplant. What's your strategy to keep this well controlled?
So I'm assuming here you mean a small window in terms of seasonal, a seasonal window to outplant. There is peak seasons and seasons that are going to be best to outplant giant kelp, but we can actually still outplant them year round. If we outplant them in summer, it's going to be a lot more of a baptism of fire. You know, really the high temperatures and the low nutrients can stress them really early on, but maybe that actually might make them more resilient in later life history stages. But generally, temperate seaweeds can be really difficult to cultivate. Sometimes they're really, really easy. Giant kelp actually in the lab is quite easy to work with relative to common kelp, which is very temperamental and very difficult to work with in the lab. Whereas again, kind of what George mentioned before, you know, that translation into the field, that translation of the ecology can be dramatically different. So Clonia, common kelp, lives everywhere in the field, really hard in the lab. Giant kelp disappearing from the field, really easy in the lab. Grow it in your bathtub.
Excellent. We have run out of time now. Thanks very much, Cayne, for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks to everyone for connecting.